Well, welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to see a great attendance this evening for this event. So this event is sponsored by the Department of Geography and the Environment. It's co-sponsored by the Arts and Sciences Contested Spaces programming this year. Also the Global Environmental Speaker Series, which is sponsored itself by Arts and Sciences, Environmental Studies, and International Studies. So we've got a lot of people interested in this topic, which is really great. And we have a great panel. So I'm going to quickly kind of turn it over to them and let them do the talking. So they each have an introduction. They're going to give you some background. And then we're going to get on their topics, issues, and some theoretical background as well. And then we're going to kind of jump into a question and answer portion of this afternoon. I can lead that and then quickly kind of transition to folks in the audience. So think of your questions. So our two speakers, we're really honored to have Dr. Patrick Bond with us. He's at Wits University in the School of Governance, Distinguished Professor of Political Ecology. He also holds an honorary professorship at the University of KwaZulu-Natal's School of Developmental Studies and came to Wits from KwaZulu-Natal. Born in Belfast, raised in the southern United States, including Virginia for part of that time, mid-Atlantic, southern United States, including Virginia for that time. Did his undergraduate at Swarthmore, and then got his PhD in economic geography from Johns Hopkins University. So after various stints with government, NGOs, community organizing, he settled squarely in academia and has been kind of in that role in South Africa since the 1990s, where he's written, co-written, or co-edited a dozen or so books that cover topics ranging from global governance to national public policy, urban problems, especially a focus on climate change. He's also regularly featured on South African television and radio news and writes columns for kind of the main newspapers at least once a month or so. Many of us know Patrick from the faculty seminar that went over to South Africa, and he was a local host for many of the events and showed great hosting ability. So it's our pleasure to be able to welcome you and host you a little bit here on campus. So maybe we'll welcome Patrick now, and then we'll talk about Mary. And Patrick's partner today is Dr. Mary Finley-Brook, who is our pleasure to house in the Department of Geography and the Environment. She also has an appointment in International Studies and works with the Environmental Studies faculty. She earned her bachelor's from University of Vermont, master's from Tulane in Latin American Studies, and her doctorate in geography from the University of Texas at Austin. Her research involves broadly renewable energy, carbon reduction, natural resource management, political geography, and she's a world-renowned expert in issues such as development initiatives, focusing on territoriality, energy production, and carbon policy. She's also highly engaged in research on transitions towards sustainability in institutions like the University of Richmond, higher education, thinking more about sustainability. So it's my pleasure to work with her in that capacity. Mary was chosen by Virginia's outgoing governor, our former governor, to join other leaders and experts in a statewide environmental justice advisory committee, where she serves with distinction. She was actually instrumental in writing the proposal to launch that committee and continues to work with that group on developing strategies for environmental justice, bringing attention to issues, in addition to kind of just increasing, a focus on increasing social equality throughout the state. So it's our pleasure to have Dr. Finley-Brook as well, and I'm going to turn it over to her at this point to kind of launch us into our discussion this afternoon. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. Good evening. I am excited to talk about environmental justice and pipelines. So geographers often look at contested spaces, and what I mean by that are locations where different interests come into conflict. And so that certainly happens in areas of infrastructure expansion. So why are gas pipelines so contested? Well, a few of the reasons I'm going to cover are land rights, investment risk, safety concerns, water and air contamination, and climate impacts. Now, infrastructure is most contentious during construction when the impacts are visible, and these can demonstrate contradictions in land and resource use, such as deforestation in areas that are designated for wildlife habitat or for tourism. The discipline of geography examines connections across space, such as linkages between consumers and sites and supply sites. So in 2015, my students and I set out to look at University of Richmond's energy supply chains. Many of these students have graduated, such as my co-author here, Mary Kate, on this 2018 research article that cites some of our findings. We brought in faculty members from other Virginian schools that purchased electricity from the same provider, Dominion Energy, and we wanted to analyze our energy connections. So gas is the largest segment in Dominion Energy's mix, and we decided to focus on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, since investments in this new infrastructure will be billed to current Dominion customers like our universities. Gas is the dominant form of energy in the US, and we have millions of miles of pipes. Yet nearly every new project is contested. Gas extraction in the US really exploded in recent years, and it was only 2 years ago that the country transitioned from being a net importer of gas to being a net exporter. We have ambitious and additional expansion projected, and the US is actually jockeying to become the #1 global gas exporter. So new liquefied natural gas, or LNG, export facilities, these remove the physical and the geographical barriers that are found in pipelines. And so what you're able to do is LNG tankers can access the most profitable global markets. But pipeline expansion was generally premised on domestic energy supply. So utility companies have been allowed to take private property through eminent domain because electricity is seen as a public good. On the other hand, export profit for corporate shareholders is not a common good. So this rise in the recent spike in gas exports feeds landowner anger about land grabs that harm local productivity. The leaky methods by which gas is currently produced, transported, and processed is another major source of contention. There is 60% more leakage of the potent greenhouse gas methane than U.S. inventory methods regularly count. This haphazard treatment of the potent greenhouse gas methane occurs at a time when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommends urgent reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to stay under the 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase this century that has been identified as a threshold for severe, pervasive, and perhaps irreversible ecological and then subsequently social disruptions. Unaccounted methane releases in the ACP are significant because of the potency of methane. One study assessing the full life cycle of the ACP suggests climate impacts for the next 2 decades could be like adding 20 coal plants. While federal agencies stall or reverse Obama-era methane rules, Virginians, worried about climate change, pressure state officials to reject pipeline permits. Suggesting a tense political climate, Governor Northam's recently announced steps to fight climate change caused by fossil fuels actually proposed slow and weak action. The governor vowed to create a body to begin to assess what data would be necessary to inform the development of future methane policy. Now, many environmentalists see these steps as too little, and they suspect the timing was an attempt to distract from growing criticism about current pipeline construction. Criticism builds from the fact that the route of the 600-mile ACP intersects important cultural and ecological resources like national forests and the Appalachian Trail. Construction requires drilling under or through water bodies in the James River watershed hundreds of times. In terms of human health, the compressor stations that move gas in pipelines release toxic air emissions in addition to methane. There are unusually large distances between the 3 compressor stations shown here, 1, 2, and 3, meaning that there'll be higher releases of contamination where these compressors are built. All three ACP compressor stations are sited in areas where income levels are below state averages and where toxic burdens are already high or risk exposure is disproportionate. Of course, we know this is historically Native American land, but consultation procedures with existing state and federal tribes did not comply with international norms for free, prior, and informed consent. In fact, 40,000 indigenous people live in a 1-mile blast zone of the ACP in North Carolina. ACP compressor stations number 2, which is going to be the focus of much of this talk, and number 3 are sited where there are more than 80% people of color, predominantly today African Americans, and this is a point I will return to later. But first, I want to introduce yet another catalyst for opposition. Studies that look at gas infrastructure holistically, rather than on a case-by-case basis, question if the ACP is necessary at all, since existing pipelines are not utilized at or near full capacity. A federal energy regulatory commissioner, Cheryl LaFleur, argued that gas in the 2 new pipelines, so you can see both of them, sorry about that, right here and here, those 2 new ones could actually be carried by just one pipeline. Yet, even if the ACP is not necessary, Dominion ratepayers must finance construction, and this raises the ire of some consumers and some consumer advocates. Several years ago, experts began documenting serious health risks from chemical additions to gas production and the release of known carcinogens like arsenic, benzene, and formaldehyde. Governor Northam became a target for criticism a few weeks ago when he spoke at an event to tackle childhood cancer. The term epistemological privilege has been used to describe the advantages of gas companies who are able to spend millions of dollars on lobbying and advertising to convince policymakers and the public that gas is safe, clean, and good for the climate. They even have the power to create a narrative that chemical inputs for hydraulic fracturing or fracking are safe enough to eat or drink. Meanwhile, scientists, on the other hand, are documenting serious concerns throughout the gas production cycle, such as this publication that just came out showing the chemical pathways that make fracking wastewater radioactive. There's many other studies like this throughout the production cycle, yet these concerns are frequently sidelined or ignored, even when, in this case, the researchers are from Dartmouth. This is where I want to target environmental racism directly. So all of us will experience some impacts of the ACP, but some people will experience greater harm due to vulnerability, proximity to exposure, or both. Babies and children and the elderly are particularly vulnerable, and Buckingham, the community selected for the compressor station siting, has disproportionately high percentages of both seniors and youth. The image on the left reads, "Don't worry about the volatile organic compounds and cancer-causing hazardous air pollutants of gas compressor stations. Dominion Energy is only building those in communities of color." The image on the right is a photo of John and Ruby Laurie, whose farm is within 1 mile of the compressor. A retired veteran, John is a deacon at the local church where he's shown here walking. This is one of the 2 historic black churches served by Pastor Paul, who is known for criticizing the creation of a sacrifice zone in Union Hill. So Pastor Paul, Dr. Lakshmi Fjord, Chad Oba, John and Ruby Laurie, and others spoke to Richmond students in a recent sustainability tour that included Union Hill. Students learned about the risk of industrial infrastructure in areas zoned rural because of lack of services like emergency responders and medical facilities. Highly pressurized gas infrastructure brings risk of fatal explosions, as recently occurred in Boston. Students were also informed of Union Hill history, whereby compressor station land was originally the site of a former large slave-owning tobacco plantation. 5 or more generations of freedmen descendants have settled around the plantation following emancipation. They continue to live in Union Hill. Yet the existence of these households was erased from federal and state permitting applications for the compressor station. This is where I became involved as a member of the Governor's Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. So last March, at the request of the communities, we began to investigate. We began to visit the community and to investigate charges of environmental racism at this and other sites along the ACP. So this was on Earth Day with a large group of people actually from Northern Virginia as well as local populations. It's called a Circle of Protection. Ella Rose lives in one of the houses most proximate to the Union Hill compressor station. Since state agencies and the firm developing the project have been unwilling to complete baseline testing, which you can see she's got set up in her bedroom there, she has been involved in a citizen science initiative that would document air and water impacts from this gas infrastructure if it's approved in November. Intersectionality, which is the combination of multiple marginalized identities, applies in this situation where an elderly black woman on a fixed income is one of the most directly impacted. Dangerous gas infrastructure is frequently cited in places like Union Hill, where the population is seen as lacking political and economic power. Returning to the topic of women, women carry more than 50% of the workload in opposition movements in Virginian pipelines. Their lives are negatively impacted by the stress of daily activism. In many cases, this has been going on for more than 4 years, every day. They often face hostility or they face attempts to discredit them due to their work. I do want to mention one other pipeline in the news for environmental racism that's getting less attention. So this is also connected to the ACP. It's a lateral line in Chesapeake and Norfolk. Both of the neighborhoods selected for siting are predominantly African American. There are 5 public schools that are located in the blast zone, and parents were not informed prior to the construction beginning. Again, we find frontline activists are often concerned mothers and grandmothers, like this expectant mom who says her baby wants to be born in a safe neighborhood. So the Governor's Advisory Council on Environmental Justice last month recommended that state agencies halt pipeline construction and fully investigate the plentiful evidence of environmental racism and the disproportionate impacts this infrastructure is having on low-income communities. Meanwhile, University of Richmond students, some of them who are here in this room, have spoken publicly about their concerns regarding climate change and environmental injustice with ACP construction. Clearly, as an institution of higher education, we need to continue to analyze our energy impacts from the electricity that we purchase through the grid, and I hope members of this academic community will join me to continue this work. But the university community also has opportunities to involve historically underserved populations in creating their own renewable energy alternatives. So University of Richmond classes and interns are researching and helping to design healthy community development and clean energy through the Buckingham Solar Collaborative. And I will answer questions later, so I'm going to stop here for now with my introduction and pass things over to Dr. Patrick Bond. But before I do, I must thank many, many people. Click to exit, you got it.
So Mary has done a formidable job of generating knowledge in conjunction with students and with the activists who I think are acting on behalf of us all. They're working in their neighborhoods, they're working on protecting their bodies, but their work against this technology and against fossil fuels will be something all of us must acknowledge for climate change purposes is vital. So I'll do something a little bit similar. The race, class, and space aspects of this will come out as I talk not about fossil fuel pipelines and we call it minerals energy complex, including excessive reliance on coal in South Africa. Now I'm really unable to get to the second presentation. It must be down here, right? Mm-hmm. This is it here?
Just click finish, both should show.
Okay, maybe I'm going to...
Just click right there.
I think the other one just put away there somewhere.
Close hers down. Just.
Okay, this is too recent, eh? Whoops. I think you're going to have to take over. This technology confounds me. And while we're setting up, it was a great privilege. Todd was very generous in the hosting that you can see actually in a little gallery I was part of. But it really is a chance to say you are and the 2 universities I'm associated with. Thank you. One in Johannesburg, WITS, one in Durban, UKZN, will always be very welcoming host to you all as we explore various joint projects. I think if I can just put that on full screen, we'll be ready to go. This is really about the water side of the work we'll do. Sure, you've caught me at a particularly incompetent moment. This high-tech from Richmond beats my... Yeah. Let's do one other thing. Let's make this full screen. That I think I can do. Okay, so pipelines, water, and sanitation give us some similar insights into spatial contradictions in a country really struggling to come out of apartheid. Do you remember fighting that system of systematic racial discrimination, which was very geographically precise, that the demand was one person, one vote in a unitary state? On April 27, 1994, that was successful. And I'll be speaking about Durban, and I live in Johannesburg. But one of the things that wasn't successful was transforming the geographic relations. Did you ever hear of the Bantustans, the old homelands, where the white government had placed people after displacing them from land and massive land theft? We'll be looking at Natal, named because Vasco da Gama arrived on Christmas Day 1497 as Portuguese explorer. But you'll see that the class discrimination, as we erased the racial lines, is now just as explicit on poverty. And it's in this Durban area where, if we look at some of the most highly praised water and sanitation interventions, including free basic water and innovations in waterless toilets, that we find some of the space, race, class, and implicitly gender discrimination. Not, Mary, that we don't have a story about fossil fuels. One of the photographs is the largest refinery complex in Africa, which is just here, and it's on that little gallery in the next door room. And the pipeline that normally would have taken under the apartheid regime, it would have taken from Durban to Johannesburg all of that oil that's being refined there, straight up along the orange line, through the equestrian zone, the rich people zone along the highway, was rerouted through the KwaZulu, the old homeland, which is 99.9% black. So even after apartheid ended, residual forces that had no respect for the direction, including pipelines that regularly explode. This is another pipeline case involving energy methane extraction from the largest landfill in Africa, which is Bosasa Road. And it led to this woman, our kind of Erin Brockovich, if you know that film, or you know the story of a heroic woman fighting against cancer-causing heavy metals coming from that landfill, which was being captured by methane pipes financed by a World Bank carbon trading scheme. All of this I won't talk about, sorry, because you've done such a good job laying the ground. I think we could move to water. However, it is in an article that City Journal would be publishing, which I've sent to Mary and to Todd. This is the pipelines that are coming out of poor shack settlements and the methane extraction. Let's just talk about the water and sanitation piping, because since 1994, when we entered a new era, the framing in South Africa is the neoliberal era. So some of you know liberals are to the left of the spectrum. Neoliberal is generally in policy terms to the right, because it relies so much on market mechanisms that the environmental justice and the rights, especially along race, class, gender lines, are erased because there's a price for everything. How would you deliver water and sanitation to the poorest people? From the Bible, right, the Economist magazine. Treat water pretty much as a business like any other. And in Johannesburg, where some of the main privatization processes unfolded, I'd keep doing that. What happened was a French company called Suez took over and was contested by a great many activists. I think this should pop right back up, right? Do you need to do anything, technical wizards, to renew my... Okay, so the Economist magazine said, although water is special, both its provision and its use will respond to economic and market signals. Do we want to give it another half a second here? My apologies, I seem to be stumbling around with your technology.
Technology stumbling with you.
And demand management is a popular green notion. Most environmentalists use the term to berate the rich world for wasting water. So this is the terrain that we're on, which is a neoliberal era in which markets are the basis great. We'll do that F5 again. Huh? Okay, I think I can take it from here. No, maybe I can't. Okay, help me. Okay. And it's here where we enter the debate about what kind of water supply and what kind of sanitation is appropriate. I think you're doing well. Let's just do that full screen. And here we enter the debate with Bill Gates, then the richest man in the world. Now, I think Jeff Bezos has taken over. Okay, so Bill Gates comes to Durban. Where are you, Bill? Yeah, so the Economist has set the terrain with a sort of mantra that the market can solve the problems. And we now meet the guru of philanthrocapitalism. That's a term that they actually like to use themselves. And this is a problem because it's highly targeted investments, market-mediated partnerships, rapid tech fixes, constant assessment, quick exits, and the use of competition benchmarking and rankings to set funding priorities. Okay, some of you get Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation money for your research faculty members. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But just be aware, this is a new trend that's kind of displacing a lot of the old aid industry social engineering. And the then richest man in the world decided he would reinvent the toilet. It's a very important project of the Gates Foundation. I mean, full credit to them to look for approaches to toilet technology that can address massive public health, gender inequity, and all of the other discriminations. The dilemma is that they've adopted the Dublin Principle, a 1992 meeting of the World Water Forum, in which water becomes an economic good. So what does that mean? When Bill Gates comes, as you see here, to Durban, South Africa, and he blogs about it on the Bill Gates blog, he doesn't like what he sees for a vast, not majority, but about 500,000 people having to use pit latrines, because there hasn't been, during apartheid, in this sort of Durban area that sits in the homelands, a chance or any desire by the white government to install flush toilets and piping. So we get into this debate about how do you handle, in the prior picture with Neil MacLeod, who's the Durban Water, and here is one of my former colleagues at UKZN, how do you manage to address the piping challenge when you actually have such poor people in the third largest city, third richest city in South Africa, who couldn't really afford to pay the operating and maintenance costs for the water, much less the capital costs. And those are the people that live outside the so-called sanitation waterborne edge. So Durban is that big chunk of the map, and you'll see there are a few little holes out on the edge, and those are the rich people's areas. Those are the areas, Gillis, Assegai, where wealthy and traditionally white people live. But in the area where about 1.5 million people live that aren't in those little pockets, that's where the city's made a public policy decision. And it's white men who make these decisions still, not to give poor black families flushing toilets. So what do they get instead is the urine diversion. Now there's a very strong argument for eco-san, ecologically sensitive sanitation, that would use your site-specific, soakaways for urine and septic tanks or biogas digesters for your solids so that you can convert to energy. I will make that case. But this isn't what this represents. This is a new form of what's called a bucket system. So the solids, when you defecate, go here, and your urine can collect here. I'm sorry for being so graphic, but this is development. You can see the diagrams. This is misleading. It comes from the city because it's never white people who are compelled. And it's always women who are doing all of the messy cleanup. The tradition here is activists who demanded one person, one vote in a unitary state weren't happy simply with sort of surface democracy. They wanted democracy in water and sanitation. And this isn't it. This is the model for removing the drying solids, kind of by hand with a shovel, removing those, and then digging a hole and planting a mango tree on top. That's the sort of public policy for that large number of people. They put in about 90,000, and you can see urine goes in one side, and with peak phosphate, with the shortage of phosphate for fertilizer, there's a sense maybe we could even dry the urine and pay people to pee and pay them roughly $3 a month if they can deliver their urine. These are very complicated systems that appeal to Bill Gates because they transcend the provision of water. And now they're using some of this. They're doing about 12 tons a day of the solids in sludge with black soldier fly larvae to create oil. So there's lots of innovations. If you're ever interested in sanitation technology, as Bill Gates is, this is definitely the place. And Bill Gates has blogged regularly, and they win all these awards for all kinds of innovations without going into details. Science magazine has written it up. Sanitation, advances water services long denied. The more or less Nobel Prize of private sector water provision, Equini Water and Sanitation, that's Durban's full name, got the 2014 Stockholm Water Industry Award. I'm giving you all this as a sense that, lots of awards, that this system that I've described to you isn't seen as a problem, notwithstanding the discrimination, notwithstanding that in Durban, a very humid city, it's really hard to get the solids to be solid, to dry because of the humidity. This is also the city with the highest number of HIV positive residents in the world, about 600,000. So to have solids and liquids when a very common problem with opportunistic infections is diarrhea is another dilemma, because you really need to have that dry to kill the pathogens, to get it out, to make it safe. So these are the kinds of things usually women are going to be responsible for the implications of a very messy system. The award that they won in Stockholm got the activists quite angry. This mocks our suffering. Now, Durban, of course, has rebuttals. They say the activists don't really know what they're talking about. But it's a very interesting way into a broader question of whether those activists who say our dignity compels the city to give us the same sanitation that they give people inside the line, basically all the white people in Durban and Indian people. And that's the dilemma. We actually have a wonderful constitution. Without spending too much time on the debates about whether constitutional language from 1996, getting past apartheid, getting into socioeconomic rights, works, just to alert you that when you do the devil in the details and you find, for example, that progressive realization of rights or budget constraints actually prevents judges from ruling in the favor of those discriminated against, like the people we just saw, then you say, well, what are the underlying neoliberal or market-related rationales? And I don't really have time in this 12 minutes to kind of explain all of the logics of economics applied to space, to race and class, but suffice to say that the potential for us having a surplus by charging rich people more that would cross-subsidize so that poor people would get resources became the agenda of these activists who wanted to realize water and sanitation as a right. We ran up against the World Bank, who came to South Africa with lots of ideas about applying market principles. So they said, for example, that if you do this free basic water, you give everyone free, but those who use too much, you charge much higher rates, which is called a rising block tariff. That goes against the logic of charging people who use too much cheaper rates, bulk discounts, let's call it. And when you do that, you're going to make privatization harder to establish. A private sector supplier, a big French water company, won't want to come in and serve Durban if you've got free basic water. Instead, you need to cut their service. Yeah, so this is the World Bank. It's a kind of logic that's, I think, quite dubious. Partly because they ignore a lot of technical factors, public health, gender equity, environment, economic multipliers, desegregation, and the fact that the state and society have an interest in resolving lots of inequities in basic services because this is a sort of public good provision. Again, without much time to explore the finer technicalities, if you divide Durban into three groups, we did win some free basic water, but the dilemma is in 1997, poor people were consuming 22,000 liters, divide by 4 for gallons, every month. And then the price of water doubled because the second block of consumption went way up. So the price doubled. And the interesting thing that we find with water, it became a luxury good. So poor people cut back from 1997 in the midst of this cholera epidemic that we were having to 2004 by about a third, down to 15,000. The wealthier and the middle class and wealthier cut down much, much lower. Some of you doing economics, you've heard of price elasticity. So for a poor household, we learned quite a lot in this, that it's really a luxury good. People really do have to cut back when the price goes up. For rich people, they don't even know, 0.1%. And that's why that very tricky free basic water promise, but as you see from this UNICEF grant, the graph, the second block goes way up. So if you use 6,000 liters, it's free. But you see what happens with that gray? It goes very, very high up to 40 US cents per liter. And this is kind of squeezing people under the rubric of rights to water, innovations. This is what's led to some of the most intense protests that I've ever seen. So it was great to see Mary providing you citizens, people testifying. This is a wonderful place to do that, and what Mary's got in terms of a mix of citizen knowledge and academic inputs, that's great. This is a little more, raw. It's really anger. This is the society where the workers every year are declared to be the angriest and most confrontational in the world. So their protests are serious. This is one in Khayelitsha, Cape Town, in which you can imagine what's in that. This is one of those buckets, right, in which the nuclear weapon of an activist is their own biopolitical output. That's all they've got left. They can't go to testimonials. They can't, and this is the premier, the sort of governor of Virginia equivalent in the Western Cape. Okay, it's a little bit uncivil society, a little less civilized. So they're doing this quite a bit. It was really at a peak when there was a visit by a US president. So Barack Obama came to Cape Town in 2013, and there was a little bit of a fear that this would then, the mayor of Cape Town giving him a key to the city, and the premier, the governor, and these activists were furious. So it's a very interesting moment where in a South Africa that's now judged the most unequal country in the world, much worse than during apartheid, where people are protesting for their rights to water and sanitation. Again and again, they shut down the road from the Cape Town airport into town. And I think some of the UR faculty who came on the trip, Todd will testify, Laura will testify about how much water was in demand in Cape Town, that they were limited to 50 liters, about 4 gallons per person per day. So this is a sort of potential scenario for real urban unrest unless we solve these problems. They become the basis for all kinds of politics and extraordinary images of people just desperate to find a place. We do have a network that does, it doesn't come up here, that does formal research on the extent to which protests of these sort can put enough pressure and raise the costs through things like blocking highways or throwing excrement at the cars of the leadership. It's appalling that it's gotten to that stage, but in a way, in some respects, when you try everything else, you use constitutional language, you try through courts, you get free basic water, and even Bill Gates comes and suggests optimal, sanitation systems, and it's rewarded all over the world. The harsh reality is it's not well accepted. The pipeline politics in South Africa applied not just to the fossil fuels, but also to something as simple as the provision of water and sanitation becomes a wonderful field of study and a vital field of action. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So, as we're kind of getting situated, we have some great time for questions, and I'll just start off by kind of asking. So some very powerful kind of critiques that you both gave to these types of concerns associated with both kind of mega projects and kind of micro-scale, kind of neoliberal, exclusionary kind of projects in two very different parts of the world. What do you feel is the role of academics like yourself, academic theory, to this public policy debate? Is there a role for the theory kind of in these situations? And what role is that? So Mary, maybe you can start, and I can kick it to Patrick.
All right. I think there definitely is a role. And one of the questions that we were addressing in preparing for this was thinking about how we bring in accounting. Does full cost accounting, does neoliberal accounting really have the implications? I think we need to have people doing research. I think we need to pay attention to the activism. We need to pay attention to what's happening on the ground. And I do think academics have an important role to play in documenting and making sure that this information gets out. I think probably most people in this room may not have known the situations that we were talking about if we hadn't done that presentation. So I know that one of my jobs is to communicate and to communicate regularly. I use my voice. I use my, the access that I have to media and to writing and to publishing to let people know what's going on that maybe otherwise wouldn't be heard. Is it a limited role? I do think that there are limitations. I think sometimes we work in a little bit of a false reality where we don't understand just how limited the so-called solutions are. A lot of what I teach in my classes is for every solution you think you're creating, you're probably creating just as many problems. And so academics are out there often, like Bill Gates, trying to put forward these great ideas without really knowing the reality on the ground sometimes. So I would caution against saying that academics are the solution, but I would certainly say that they can play an important role.
No, I'm with you. And I think I tried to toss out a couple of theories. So do you remember The Economist magazine has a market-oriented theory? We call that neoliberalism. We have a political strategy for change, often called liberal, which relies on constitutionalism and equity, including in provision of water. Both those, I think, come up short in the actual delivery. And if it just saves money not to give people enough water to flush, that's the bottom line. And therefore, a theory, in a sense, coming from, I often use the social movement theories from the United States. Some of them are very practical. They're about tree shakers and jam makers. They're about people on the outside who can do the kinds of protests you saw, whereas their allies on the inside then have more power to establish policies that are more compatible with desires, with the lived reality. I think racial justice and gender justice scream out in some of these cases. And I'm also very interested, for those of you who are geographers, in combining spatio-temporal relations. That's actually the subject of the article for City, because it turns out many of those mega projects are, including big pipeline decisions, are based on long-term assumptions that what appear to us now as white elephants will one day be profitable. In the case of profitable long-term use of gas pipelines, of oil pipelines from Durban, in fact, even drilling offshore Durban, I think everyone in the room will agree we have to actually phase out fossil fuels. Those are not going to be good investments. That's unburnable carbon, right? This is what we have to be leaving underground. And I think it's there, Todd, that a new theoretical approach will be coming up more and more based on environmental justice. I happen to study at Johns Hopkins with David Harvey, who's been exploring the interface of historical geographical materialism and the environmental justice groups. And maybe we can even switch to thinking about these groups. Do they produce knowledge? Because an epistemology, a production of knowledge strategy that actually relies on some of these groups creating a little bit more heat than we do in our academic armchairs, also creates the opportunity to produce knowledge, even if they lose.
Great. It's a great segue to my follow-up on that. You both provide some really evocative, powerful imagery kind of in your presentations. And so to turn the perspective around a little bit, when have and can grassroots social, ecological labor, especially youth movements, make a difference in these types of situations? And I don't know if you want to do the same order again.
Sure. So I think what I've seen is grassroots movements are making a difference. So for those of you who have been following the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, it has been opposed, very heavily from the beginning. It's something that probably was already going to be at stages of construction. The reason why that hasn't happened yet is ongoing opposition. There has been so many legal cases, which is really building from the grassroots. But there are also limitations to what grassroots actors can do. And I think one of the reasons why is they are often these marginalized populations that have been targeted because they're seen as not having political power. In the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, there were rural communities. So in Richmond, maybe we don't pay attention to what's happening outside in the rural areas. That's what people in Buckingham would certainly say. But I do think that there's important things that we need to think about in terms of how to make these movements stronger. One of the things that we've seen happen with pipelines is that impacted communities, I've seen people come from Pennsylvania and West Virginia and from places where pipelines were put in and where hydraulic fracturing has been happening for a long time. And they're realizing that they're getting sick. They're realizing that even though they have a gag order because they went to get medical treatment because of the fact that they got sick because of a compressor station or some other natural gas infrastructure, that they still need to speak out. I think I've heard quite a number of people say, if I've got cancer and I know my days are numbered, am I really going to let this company shut me down? And so they're here in Virginia building movements. They're the ones who are doing some of this citizen science. And so it's not just looking at when you've already been impacted building that movement. I see a lot of that, but also then reaching to who else has power. And I would certainly suggest that consumers have a lot of power. I would really encourage everybody in this room to think about maybe some of the moral or the ecological sensibilities that you think about when you burn energy. Are these energy systems, do they fit with your moral and ecological sensibilities? And if they don't, then what maybe do you want to do about it? Maybe we're being given a challenge here to kind of pay attention to the connections that we have around the world. So I do think the grassroots movements make a difference, but I don't think it should be just one small community up against a near monopoly or up against a really entrenched state government.
And Mary, connections around the world and a globalization of people process is actually why South Africa was freed from apartheid, because not only were people in the same kind of way you just saw protesting and making, the phrase was the society ungovernable, they had allies. Here in Richmond, there was some anti-apartheid movement in the city that was formidable. And all across the world, in the 80s, those allies of South African Democrats, black South Africans, said, you shouldn't have investments in South Africa, you shouldn't make loans. And by cutting off the financial lifeblood to the apartheid regime and its white business allies, in 1985 they created the conditions for an economic crisis that compelled white business to go visit the African National Congress. Mandela was still in jail another 9 years, but it was an exceptional moment of finding the globalization of people against the globalization of capital. Todd, the other inspiration, in addition to seeing the end of apartheid through that process of interconnectivities, was getting free AIDS medicines for about 6 million people in a very similar way, because activists in South Africa, Treatment Action Campaign, were calling their allies. There was a group in New York called ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, to help fight the Clinton and then Bush administrations about 18, 20 years ago, to get medicines that weren't branded, that cost $10,000 a year, so nobody in South Africa or Africa could afford them, and instead make them generic. So this is a debate you're all having now about the high cost of medicines, but for Africans and poor people across the world who are HIV positive, it was a death sentence, because to get the medicines to strengthen your immune system was impossible, and it was only with Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, and these activists in ACT UP that the Treatment Action Campaign could compel the World Trade Organization and World Health Organization to put those medicines, and by the way, they extend to things you're worried about, Zika, Ebola, on an exemption from branded medicines intellectual property. It's a trade-related intellectual property system. So just very briefly, I've always been inspired that instead of 0 people getting those medicines, it's 6 million, and the life expectancy in South Africa went from 52 to 64 since 2004 as a result of the globalization of people against the globalization of capital, Big Pharma Corps. You don't mind my little slogans. I mean, your people are better at it than me. The main point, though, for the discussion of piping, if it's unjust piping that will wreck your future, your generation should be really angry on a generational basis, right, with us. There's a word for what Mary's people are doing, blockadia. And were the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change capable of keeping Donald Trump in or punishing him for dropping out last June, capable of putting binding, accountable systems into place, not voluntary, bottom-up, but just, you can pollute, I can pollute, let's call it a Paris Climate Agreement. It doesn't mean anything. With very inadequate targets, with things like carbon trading, with making illegal, if you sign it, the claim of a climate debt, in a sense, the justice out the window. The UNFCCC's utter inadequacy, the failure of negotiators at the Paris Climate Accord and the Durban one in South Africa in 2011, and the strength of Todd Stern, the US State Department's representative, the strength of China, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, the BRICS, in alliance with the polluters of the United States and Europe, means we and your generation will not solve climate change. And therefore, we have to have something different. And really, Todd, that's ultimately the bottom line. You can read a book by Naomi Klein called This Changes Everything. Is it one you've read? It should be your Bibles, next generation kids, right? Because she comes to the same conclusion that with the failure of our world leaders, with the ability of Donald Trump to wreck the climate and have no penalty, it's going to be blockadia at this stage in the struggle for sane climate policy. So more power to your mates there.
Wonderful, thanks. This time, let's open it up, and if there are questions, kind of from anybody in attendance here, if don't think we're intimate enough. If you project your voice, I think we don't need to pass around the microphone. So, Maribel.
And names too, would that be good?
Hi.
Yeah, if you could provide your name too, but that would be great.
Sure. Hi, my name is Maribel. I'm a student here. My question is, I guess, for the both of you, in terms of understanding the differences in the differences of realities. Right now, there's a movement of people going off grid. They're really embracing composting as an alternative method to like toilets and sanitation, I guess. But we're seeing that people are rejecting it in South African countries. Can you speak a little to that? I know there's obviously a lot of disparities at play, but I'm just wondering your opinions, I guess, on this increasing movement in kind of developed nations and then in underdeveloped nations, they're rejecting something that other people are gung-ho about.
Good. Should we take a few, or what do you like? What's your normal style? Do you take a few more and we put them together, or should we do
Sure. I thought if you have a quick response to that, maybe we can do just quick hits.
Yeah, no, the most advanced is Sweden, where the waterless sanitation options are quite luxurious. No smells, it's basically out of sight, out of mind, just the way all of us enjoy waterborne sanitation. South Africa, as you saw, is a crude bucket system which are meant to handle your excrement. For many of these people, they see white people never having to adopt this technology. What we'd love is to have on-site sanitation with a small flush and a biogas digestion. I mean, there are technical answers to this. However, they cost lots more. First, that you're putting some water in, and then that you're constructing a system that provides methane back, which you can use for cooking. But the cost per unit is not something that anyone can go out and buy because they're basically very poor people. And that's where the fight is. It's over subsidization. And if you can make a genuine eco-san, especially one that doesn't smell and doesn't have these features, I think you'd find enormous support. So again, more power to Bill Gates as he searches for a technical fix. The problem is, in the meantime, this is not a particularly good technique, as the 99% of the people polled, even by the city, a sample of 17,000, say, we don't like this, we want a flush toilet. I should have put that in. This is profoundly unpopular technology, and if we're going to do tech fixes, they may cost a bit more, and the temporality investment, how long will those last, becomes a feature. And if you're a neoliberal, and you're in the Bill Gates tech fix plus market solutions, you don't really think about long-term for poor people. You might for mega projects, but that's the dilemma, is to get all of those aligned so that instead of it just being a discriminatory system where black people, poor people, women are disadvantaged by the weak technological fix, we should actually have social, environmental, and water sanitation justice, and finding that sweet spot's not impossible. Your generation may do that.
So that's certainly a take-home I've had from talking with the two of you. These quick fix technology fixes are people can become very enamored with them, but there's a lot of complexities to all of these issues that get glossed over with that. Other questions out there? Who else has something they want to share to the conversation here? Either about the mega projects going on in our own backyard, the kind of neoliberal, kind of exclusionary micro infrastructure projects in South Africa, grassroots movements. Yeah, Cass.
Hi, my name is Beth. My question is specifically about South Africa. I know recently they have passed the motion to seize lands from white farmers, and I want to know how that kind of changes the dynamic between the pipeline for fuel for sanitation, or does it not affect it at all?
No, it's such a good, complicated question because the main opposition to fracking, because fracking strategies are basically on white-owned land, is actually white farmers and white conservationists. And the contradictions there are enormous, you can imagine, right? They're the owners of illegitimately acquired land. And yet they're also, for example, our strongest allies in preserving large chunks of land for conservation purposes. So there's an award that is given every year in the United States. Several people in the South have gotten it, called the Goldman Prize, but it's given to one per continent each year. And the anti-fracking movement, led by a white man, got one. And that was one of those moments where we could say, okay, you're an award winner for fighting fracking on your farmland, and you've been very effective. You've got all the skills that having white privilege gives you, including access to courts. You fought hard. But if you're not doing it in the context of a South Africa where whites have had this just awful, history, crime against humanity, what use is that? And this is one of the most amazing moments for us to ask, as we did actually when our faculty visited the Umfolozi Game Park, where white conservationists found an alliance with black peasant women to fight coal. The intersections and the need, especially for those of us, I inherited all my white privilege as well, to learn some humility and to go with the organic intellectuals of the black communities. We never get it right, but it's always a constant struggle. I mean, there must be the same thing, Mary, here. You put black activists struggling against the pipeline. What's the relationship, especially of an academic, with white skin privilege to those movements? I mean, we always make messes of those relationships. How do you do it here?
Listen, a lot.
Yeah.
That's the main point. I mean, it's very, very difficult. I find people are actually quite eager to work with me, but I have to be careful to recognize my privilege in those situations and make sure that I'm not telling people what to do and that I'm really listening. So I think that's really the foundation of it. There is a lot of conflict in terms of how do we move past how do we really recognize some of these challenges in the broader environmental movement? So one of the things that we know about green organizations is they really have a diversity problem. And so while we've done a better job in terms of increasing diversity, we have not necessarily improved equity or inclusion. And so when you look at the environmental movements and when you look at the environmental organizations, there really is quite a lot of discrimination and oppression of black voices and brown voices within even environmental movements. And so I think recognizing that and stepping out of the way a lot, because I could be handed the microphone all the time and I need to make sure that I don't take it a lot of the time.
Could I just make one little input? Because I was very impressed sitting in Johannesburg that 2 weeks ago, did anybody see what was going on in San Francisco? What was happening there? A global climate summit hosted by Jerry Brown, the outgoing governor of California. But wait a minute, so there was a march of 30,000 people demanding climate action. Did you see that on a Saturday? I think you were having protests here in Richmond at the same time. But there was something else. The following Thursday, when Brown's gathering, including Al Gore, they came, but they had a different agenda. Their climate action was what I would call neoliberal. It was market-centric. It was, let's take California's cap-and-trade system, carbon trading, and let's extend that. Let's leapfrog Donald Trump using conscious corporations, technological fixes, market mechanisms. And there outside were 1,000 climate justice protesters. Do you see the difference? Climate action has been basically adopted as all of the kinds of things we hear about. Divestment movements, the lobbying for better laws, quite civilized society activism. Climate justice, which is led by the Indigenous Environmental Network, people of color and communities for a better environment in LA and in the West Coast Climate Justice Alliance. There's a group there called Movement Generation in Oakland, and they are people of color saying climate justice means you don't solve a market-related problem, spewing pollution into the air as an externality with market solutions. You don't let bankers have the platform to solve the climate crisis when they can't even control their own financial markets, right? That's a recipe for disaster, as it has been. I think that's one of the good signals that there's a maturing, and it's something I've seen for about 15 years. I even wrote a book called Politics of Climate Justice, based on being quite inspired by people of color-led movements from the grassroots doing Blockadia. The Canadians are maybe the highest profile, but Standing Rock, where Native Americans in North Dakota fought until late 2016, didn't win, but they fought very valiantly. To me, that would be one of the interesting ideological signals that also goes with paying close attention to grassroots sentiments. They have an agenda of justice.
So many facets to this environmental to these inequalities, right? And it's encouraging, but somewhat disappointing in the same in the same way that Virginia now has, for the first time, an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, right? Like, when you think of all up and down the line, the way inequalities come into the equation at so many different levels. Another question, do we have another kind of anybody else? Yeah.
And your name?
I'm Haley. You mentioned the term philanthropic capitalism, and I was wondering if, and you also mentioned that the Gates funded project with the water goods didn't work out due to cultural and practical reasons. I was wondering if you could maybe state your opinion on other ways that the Bill Gates Foundation or groups with large amounts of money could monetarily support issues.
Well, just on that, you don't have to take it from me. When the climate action movement put $200 million, I'm not exaggerating, into the Waxman-Markey legislation in 2009. Okay, that's technicist, it's carbon trading. It was what Al Gore had hoped would go through. The Republicans were climate denialists. It was very hard. That was the best they thought they could get. $200 million of Rockefeller, Ford, Bill and Melinda Gates, all of the lobbying money went there. And in the book I did, I'll be happy to send you a PDF, I go through the climate justice movement's reaction, because they were underfunded. They weren't getting any resources. They were just off the map. And to me, if you wanted to start saying, those with excess capital, you want to burn it? Okay, you could throw it away on hopeless market-based strategies like carbon trading. That's been done. Or you could start figuring out creative ways to pay the North's climate debt. Now, I happened to be in Ecuador earlier this month, where the best case, so some of you interested in the, if you're an aficionado of how do you get the North to pay the climate debt, the best single project is called Yasuni, Y-A-S-U-N-I, in which is the most biodiverse hotspot in the world on the Peru-Ecuador border. And it's got, unfortunately, $10 billion worth of oil underneath this beautiful park. And of course, that's very tempting for a poor country like Ecuador. So there's a kind of choice. Do you drill to get at the oil? It's unfortunately a Chinese company has begun the process, because the last president of Ecuador, the prior president, Rafael Correa, led us to believe that, okay, instead of drilling, we could get money from the north. Unfortunately, his attempt was with the Norwegians, the Germans, the Italians. Wonderful people. But they didn't want to pay the climate debt. They wanted this beautiful land to be the subject of a carbon trade, which means we will protect that land, but in exchange, you have to let our companies pollute more. That was the trade-off. And I think we're trying to change that narrative to say, no, you don't do a carbon trade to leave the oil under the soil. No, you owe a climate debt. Make the down payment $3.75 billion so they don't have to drill, because it costs about $6 billion to drill, and it would destroy all of this beautiful biodiverse area. We've been struggling to get this to work. We need your generation to ask yourselves, are you privileged? Okay, you're going to be really messed up by my generation, by me flying here to visit you. You owe me some rage, some anger, your parents. But you also have some creative ways to think about how the North pays its debt to the victims of climate change. What would those ways be? One example, Yasuni. Another is a basic income grant to be paid to the victims of climate change in areas that are suffering desertification. We have one great example in Namibia. So I write a fair bit about this, but until the people of the North, people of goodwill, people who understand that the North has created a problem for the world, until you get better mobilized, this is all theory. I wonder if we could turn it to people who are organizing, you know? Is there anybody out there that's saying, hey, this is working? How are we getting through in an era of Donald Trump to say, well, we owe a climate debt, we'll have to get through a bad president who's making it worse. And, okay, you can organize against EPA, against a bad president. But I think I'm asking you to make a long-term commitment, right, to be a good citizen of the earth.
That's a good ask. And I see we're already pressing against our time limit here already, but I want to give Mary a chance to respond. And I was wondering if also in that, Mary, you might want to kind of close this session. Also, is it possible to give kind of the latest update on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and kind of where that, you brought it really, like what's the latest kind of where that stands and what's the next steps in that story?
Well, that story will give you whiplash if you're actually paying attention to it day by day. So I don't know what round of legal suits we're in currently against the Forest Service. And so part of the problem has been there's a lot of people who feel and several legal cases that suggest that the National Park Service and the Forest Service maybe didn't uphold what their duty is and to protect some of these cultural and ecological resources. So that's one of the court cases that is completely pending at this point. We have several court cases that are looking at environmental racism and discrimination and violation of civil rights. Unfortunately, one of those is being caught up on a technicality, but we expect that to progress forward. At this point, some of the final permitting that will come in is the compressor station that I was talking about. That air permit has been pushed off till November 8th. We should get a decision. We probably would have known already, except for the fact that this has been an incredibly contentious process with a lot of local opposition. So that's a major unknown. Some of the things that people are considering is that there's been a shift in markets. There's a question of whether this economically makes the sense that people thought maybe 3 years ago when they were starting to plan some of this stuff. Is there the need for some of the gas? Is there the investment for the gas? How far out are we looking when we're putting in billion-dollar investments such as this? So, for example, when the Environmental Justice Advisory Council put out our request for a moratorium on the pipelines, the people who called us were the market analytics. They were Bloomberg. They're wondering, are pipeline opponents going to stop these pipelines? Because, as I said, every single one is contested. So there's market opposition, there's legal opposition. None of it has certainly been put through. There's a question whether the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who approved it quite a bit ago, whether they did their job. So there's actually an asking for a rehearing of that. So my answer would be there's a big question mark next to this. It is quite possible that it'll all be resolved by November, but I know that the lawsuits won't. So even if it's permitted by November, I think there's a big question mark as to when it goes through and whether it'll be stopped.
So opportunities to take up Patrick's challenge to engage locally, lots of opportunities.
Lots of opportunities.
Like. And so I think I heard at one point an invitation for all of us to come visit Johannesburg and Durban, but be mindful of our carbon footprints as we go. But there's also lots of work in this area, kind of right here in Virginia. So I think with that, let's thank Dr. Bond and Dr. Finley-Brook.